Hi, I'm Alex, and along with Dr. Russell Cohen-Hoffing, I host Field Test, a podcast game show all about cutting-edge scientific collaborations. You might be wondering why we chose such a zany format for what feels like such a serious topic. After all, shouldn't science be treated with the utmost sincerity? But in Russell and I's time as science communicators, we found that the biggest impediment to people's understanding of just how important science is to their lives is that it feels like something removed, something that happens elsewhere. So we hope that the fun and games element of this show makes you laugh. But more than anything, we hope that they help show you that the collaborative teams we have as our guests are real people, just like you and me. Anyway, let's field test.
Welcome to Field Test, the game show where we not only test scientists on the facts, but also on their friendship.
Field Test is a production of NSIN X-Force in support of US CCDC Army Research Labs, the Army's public-facing research arm. The lab is a scientific ecosystem which generates knowledge products ranging from impactful basic science to startup spin-offs. I am Alex Schiffman, and with me as always is the cognitive scientist for all of us, your host, Dr. Russell Cohen-Hoffing. Russell, who are our guests today?
Today we're joined by a pair of philosophers. We have Colonel David Barnes. Thanks for joining us, Dave.
Hey, great to be here.
And Colonel Robert Underwood. Thanks for joining us, Bob.
Thank you. Good to be here as well.
Yeah, so this show is really focused on collaborations, and philosophy and the Army and ethics is like a really new concept for me. I haven't really thought about how those things intermingle, so I'm like really excited to talk about this today and kind of kick this off. I don't know. Can you guys give us a picture of like how does philosophy and ethics actually play into the world of
well, sure. Army? One of the things that I usually start off with in conversations, both in the government with the Army as well as with academia, is this idea that that things we're talking about in technology aren't ethical decisions, or the things in the military they're in some other realm. And the thing to keep in mind is that any time that we're making a decision, and particularly on the battlefield, where it can affect the livelihood of other people, those are value laden, right? And so there's a long history that both Bob and I have studied on the relationship between fighting a war and sort of this all free-for-all, everything goes sort of idea of an unlimited, unrestricted warfare, and a competing notion of this notion of humanity and rights and respect and dignity for others. And because war is so damaging, right, because it's so costly, might there be reasons that we should put limitations and constraints from an legal perspective, but also from the legal perspective as well, right? So ethical as well as the legal piece.
Can I ask I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step over somebody. It sounded like you said that the use of certain technologies was not an ethical consideration. Did I hear that right, or were you saying it was an ethical?
But I started off by saying that that's a myth, right? So this idea
that's
that
a myth.
right that that people hold, and we'll talk about it, right? It's it's a math equation that has no moral status. Well, maybe not, but the humans are the ones we're making those decisions, right? And so thinking about our decision making broadly, in particular in the military, right? When it affects other people, right? I think at a minimum that has ethical implications.
So yeah, Bob, how would you describe how does philosophy fit into the Army world?
So I like to start. I'm a moral philosopher, and it's important to get to the ethical conversation. I like to try to subvert it a little bit, though, by starting by asking whoever has given me this question whether or not they think they act for reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And we tend to think that everything we do is for a reason, and we like to be acting according to good reasons. And as soon as you say that you want to act for reasons and you want to act for good reasons, I've got you. You're doing philosophy. And so I try to widen the scope of what the Army does and how it impacts or is informed by the practice of philosophy. So not just the moral questions that Colonel Barnes was talking about, but also, like I'm a cavalryman and I exist to produce information for my higher headquarters. And I have to understand what counts as true and false, what counts as good questions, those sorts of things. And as soon as we're having those kinds of conversations, we're just smack dab in the middle of what philosophy has been talking about since Plato and Socrates.
Do you find, and I think this goes to something that Dave was saying about how there's a myth that these aren't ethical or moral questions, do you find with certain of your colleagues in the military that trying to engage with some of these questions on a moral or ethical grounds rather than a maybe logistic or practical grounds has a lot of pushback that, well, these aren't the questions we need to be talking about, we have to get X to A to do B rather than like discussing the analytic morality of whether or not doing this action gives good results or something like that?
So I have found some pushback when we're explicit about the questions, right? So if we start from whether or not this is moral or legal, sometimes, especially when what we're trying to do seems to be limited in some way by those questions, then I will get the pushback. What you might call the realist, although that's a loaded term, but
not a philosophical realist.
Not a philosophical realist, but this is morality doesn't have any space here because we're talking about war. But almost usually in the very next breath, those folks that do that will give me arguments and speech that are just as value laden as any as any moral philosopher's speech. A good example of this is the Melian dialogue in Thucydides, where you have the Spartan generals sort of, and usually we take the Spartan generals to be making fun of the Melians who they're about to beat up and kill for trying to bring morality into a question of strategy and warfare. But if you really read what the Athenian generals are talking about, they're talking about their own set of values.
This the divide between strategy or where strategy and morals kind of impact us, I think is a really good tee up for our first game. We're gonna move on to a warm up before we get to our first game. Let's first, I guys, tell how all of these games work. So we're going to be playing a series of games with you to illustrate the strength of your guys' team, and to illustrate the science and the research that you guys have been working on to have some fun while we're doing it. So each game that we're playing, you're going to be winning a series of points to gain more than team field test. And if you'd win, you're going to get a prize. So, but you're playing on behalf of somebody else. So Bob, who are you going to be playing on behalf of today?
I'm playing on behalf of my dad, Ed Underwood.
Awesome. And Dave, how about you?
As much as I like to play on behalf of Bob's dad as well, I will play on behalf of my father, who is unfortunately not with us anymore. But in the line with that same kind of thinking, I think play for our fathers.
That's awesome. Awesome. All right, so we're going to get started. with our first little warm up. But right before we get started, Bob, Dave, do you guys have any words of encouragement for each other?
Sir, I think we've been in much worse contexts at much worse disadvantage. Just so that your audience knows, you guys have done a really good job of stacking the deck against us. But I think we'll be able to figure it out.
Right. Other than our absolutely fabulous hairstyle choice, I think that's probably the strongest thing we have going for us in our team.
Yeah.
So we'll do the proverbial,
Not all
no.
philosophers are bald, and not all Army guys are philosophers. But if you're a bald Army guy, you might be a philosopher.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's move right along into our first game that we're going to be getting some points for. So this is the acronym game, and I'm going to start off with an acronym that I came up for Alex, and you get 5 points if you correctly guess the acronym, and you have 1 minute to do so. All right. So, Alex, are you ready to demonstrate this and win all of the points?
I'm ready to win all the points.
Okay. All right. Why don't Bob give us a countdown?
Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
All right, Alex. So the acronym is DSCVOC, DSCVOC. We're gonna go with the first one. D. This is man's best friend. S is something they do really well. C is the thing we're having to deal with right now, the pandemic. All right, and a VOC, is something that is explosive. It is like a volcano. There's a situation where things could go up at any moment. It is a
go to the next one.
Blank.
Dogs smell COVID.
Okay. O is what farmers do if they don't want to spray pesticides and get certified for this.
Dogs smell COVID. I don't know. Go to the next one.
C is harder. C is chemicals put together make up a compound. Okay. So O is and we are out of time.
On volatile chemicals. Dogs smell COVID on volatile chemicals? Okay.
Yeah, so they've just done some training so for dogs to smell COVID, basically volatile organic compounds. I like this one just because I think it's just amazing that COVID has a smell. Just like other things just have smells that we just have no idea about.
Pretty amazing, but I guess anything as long as it's a chemical has a type of smell if your nose is good enough.
If your nose, yes, that's right. Yeah, if your nose can get it in there. All right. Well, we have 0 points out of that. But so the first one is going to be who is up first. So Dave is going to be giving clues first for this one. So same exact thing. You have an acronym, and you're going to be giving clues to Bob. Are you clear on the rules or how to do this? Do you need any clarification?
One bit of
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, one bit of clarification. So I give Bob that acronym or the letters first, or is it?
Yep.
And then he fills like, okay, cool.
All right, let's do this. Alex, give us a count off.
3, 2, 1, go.
Right. The acronym is KRN. First clue, a person who wants to end the life of another person. We might call that individual
Killer.
An entity that's usually thought of as autonomous, that has limbs, that can perform work.
Robot.
More of a metaphysical kind of state, but we have concerns that there is no possible world, one that, if anything, would be further remote in terms of whether a being is present or not. All right, I know that's a little bit off. All right, so it is or it ain't, and if it ain't, then it might be
not.
And if it's not what? To be or not to be? What if you're not to be?
And that is time. Do you have a guess,
Wow.
Bob? Do you have a guess? Give a guess.
Anything but no.
It was all
Non-existent.
my bad.
Non-existent.
Non-existent.
That was the most philosophy-laden way of saying 3 words. We think of them as autonomous, these beings.
That's why philosophers are the best cocktail party people to invite, right? We just have an incredible.
Yeah, you really operationalize those 3 words.
So that was great. So Dave, this word killer robots are non-existent. So this was for Bob. This was taken from one of Bob's articles that he's written in lectures that he's given. So just to jump right into this, can you what does this mean, Bob? Give us the 30,000 foot picture of what this means.
I should credit my buddy from Oxford, who is the one who actually wrote the article. I talk a lot about this, but the idea comes from Mike Robillard and his argument. And so the 30,000 foot view is that it's really just confusion over the word autonomous, and when autonomy actually means something morally important. So the way I start this is by just claiming, in the classic philosophy way, of just saying, look, there's no such thing as killer robots. And while that's obviously false, it's also, in a sense, true, because it's really important to understand the problem we're trying to talk about when we talk about killer robots is whether or not there's a morally autonomous agent doing the work. And the other thing that we're trying to get at when we talk about this is the really important part is that robots and killing and war don't really raise any new moral questions, right? So they're either fully autonomous in the moral sense, and then we have all those questions in place because we've been killing with morally autonomous agents for a long time, i.e. human beings. Mm-hmm. Or they're just another set of tools in the hands of morally autonomous agents, and we've been dealing with those questions for a long time as well.
So I want to clarify, exactly. I think maybe the lay interpretation of a killer robot is something like the Terminator, or and I guess to give words to why that feels or why that feels scary is that there's some cold, unfeeling machine that can make lethal decisions by itself, and so you're rejecting that outright, saying that those that's just a same old problem, and 2, those don't even exist in the first place. Is that?
Yeah.
Is
so
that right?
what I'm rejecting outright is that the existence of those kinds of systems raise any new moral questions. Right. So, the descriptions that we can give about feeling preyed upon by morally autonomous robots. The most recent one that I love that I thought really got after this was I think it's Heavy Metal, that episode of Black Mirror that where the little robot dog just ran across all of England chasing this guy. But so there's this pretty authentic human reaction to being preyed upon. But if you know a lot about the experience of war, we've had that feeling for a long time. The first guy to go to war with somebody, you have a spear and the guy you're fighting has an arrow, and he's killing you from 300 yards away, and you can't even get up the hill to fight him. You're going to have these same sorts of feelings, right? And the same thing happens with third world armies fighting folks like the U.S. with jets and drones and stuff like that. And so there's the fact that it's a Terminator robot that's cold and unthinking. The phenomenology of being killed by a human being at distance is the same as the phenomenology of being killed by the Terminator at distance. And so, it's one of these classic philosophical baits and switch for me to say something outlandish like there's no such thing as killer robots. Well, how in the world am I going to prove this? And then I sort of bait and switch you into the conversation that I'm trying to have, which is, even if we had killer robots, what you're worried about is something we've been worried about for a long time.
And I know you might be surprised that as a fellow philosopher, I find myself in violent agreement with Bob on at least on this point.
First time that's ever happened.
It's probably note it, mark it down, and I'm sure that'll be the end of the team after this.
Yeah.
Could I try and put this again in layman's terms? The question it seems that you're looking at is one of like maybe where the buck stops, right? As in terms of moral agency, like who's the actor, or to use a very loaded term, but one that I think laymen would understand would be something like blame, right? For an action, I get that that's a very loaded term, but like who was the person or who was the agent who did the action? And so either these robots are persons, and so they did the action, and then it's the same as any other person doing an action to you, or they're tools, and then it's the same as a person with a knife doing the action to you.
Exactly right.
So maybe spell that out a little bit. Like, what exactly is the like then how do you reduce this to a philosophical problem that you can tackle? I mean, like how can you answer this problem of like, well, then who should we blame? Like, and this is, I've always wondered about this. Like, I'm a scientist, and I'm doing work for the Army that supposedly in the future will somehow get incorporated into what soldiers actually use. Is the problem then just something having to do with indirectness, like how much indirectness there is in between the agent doing it and the person who had a hand in that act?
Yeah, so you guys are exactly right. So this is just a fairly familiar and timeless problem of the moral responsibility we all hold for collective actions, that we are, on some sliding scale in terms of contribution, some sliding scale in terms of, the power you have to change things, those kinds of things, like, how the moral division of labor, or how the division of labor turns into a moral division of labor, and those sorts of things. So it's really that's one of the places where I like the conversation to go, which is, let's talk about the moral implications of collective action and what that tells us about who should die.
I mean, the battlefield is really complex today, and people have a misrepresentation to think that it's individuals picking out another individual and engaging them in harm with the intent to kill them. I mean, that happens. The casualties on the battlefield now are much more diverse. They're spread out. They're separated by distance and time. The more responsibility that Bob is talking about. And this is no different in a lot of use of other technologies. We've sort of created a new problem, and it's in the sense it's covered. It's become murky. And informed by growing up with a lot of science fiction in a way that we might want to treat an autonomous weapon system or another robot as something more than what it is, right? We want to anthropomorphize it. And so you look at a vehicle, even not one that's autonomous, but even a regular vehicle, how when we think of responsibility in terms of blameworthiness or who might be liable for that, right? The insurance companies, in a sense, have collectively figured this out, right? In a sense, there may be some distributed, shared sense of responsibility to different degrees. And then the military, to sort of add to that, we have this notion of command responsibility. So somebody like Bob and his squadron, if he's going to employ a system, I mean, he's going to be responsible for the risk associated with employing that system the same way, or at least analogous, I think, to the way that he would say, I want my Delta troop to go out and perform such and such function, right? Even though we're dealing with a system constructed solely of humans versus one that's a human machine team, right? In a sense, a lot of that will be shared. And from the military's perspective, if something goes wrong, having assumed that we've done the necessary testing, evaluation, verification, validation, giving that product, that system to Bob to employ in the field, and he has tested and trained with it, and he trusts it to employ it, I mean, he's going to bear some of that responsibility, or his operator will. I mean, this whole idea that Sparrow raises that, it could be the programmer, it could be this, it could be all these other things. Well, yes, but no, that's not really the moral dilemma that he raises.
So I want to get into our next game, because I think this is a good jumping off point that y'all are making the case that this is an old problem, but that's still, because it's an old problem, there are ways to, I guess, act morally in these contexts. So Alex, let's go on to our next acronym game, and he has a game for me. And then Bob will be on the clue giving side this time around.
Russ, all
right. So
I chose a long one.
I did too, because I thought we've just been really good at this. Try to make it a little harder. But
I think we're wrong. I think you and I are hamstringing ourselves.
All right. So Dave, give us a count.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The acronym for you, Russell, is LEFRAABPAM. The first L is thing they use in Space Wars.
Lasers.
The next one, you put the F. You put two things together. Dragon Ball Z, they do the blank dance.
Fuse. Laser fusion.
The R is nuclear plants have one.
React. Reactor.
A is when you're walking up to someone, you are
acting.
Getting closer to them.
Approaching.
BP is B is something's on fire. It's on fire, so it's
burning.
The
burning.
The P is
phosphorus.
No, the P is what's in your TV or what's in your bones.
Photodiodes.
It's in space too. It's in the sun.
Time.
Laser fusion reactor approaches burning plasma milestone.
Plasma.
We got pretty close, honestly.
Wow, that was pretty good. We don't get any points, but we get some pats on the back.
I'm patting you on the back right now.
It was a moral victory.
Yes, you're right. And on this episode with philosophers, that's the most important thing. This is
no points, but all of the moral victories. All right, so we are neck and neck at 0 points each. That means that you guys have the opportunity to take this as sweepingly. So, Bob, are you ready?
Yes, although, sir, just to put you at ease, I have put my penchant for Hegel on the shelf, and I'm focusing on analytic approaches to these questions. So,
all right, in 3, 2, 1.
The acronym is Echo India Alpha. Echo India Alpha. Echo. The study of moral value in action is
ethics.
Correct. India. Not dumb systems, but
intelligent.
Correct. And Alpha. Humans, robots, and a good dog are all in some sense one of these.
Agent.
All right. Killed it. Good job.
Wow, that is the best description of what an agent is in a philosophical sense I've ever heard.
It was the dog being thrown in at the end
dog.
Was the clincher.
Only a good dog. Bad dogs are not ethical agents. Cats are never morally responsible for what they do.
So this is ethics of intelligent agents. So we've been talking about, the moral problem of robots, of which you can also call an agent, and perhaps if an autonomous one would be an intelligent agent. So since this is not an old problem, that as I started out, there are ways to act ethically when creating these. Am I right in saying that?
So sure, right? I mean, in a sense, it's keeping a mind towards what the objective is in terms of how the system's going to operate in this interaction with the environment, but it's also taking into consideration your values and recognizing that the decisions you're making along the way, all the way from design through development, deployment, and eventual use, may be values laden. Right. For example, if you're a data scientist and one of the goods that you want to achieve is to optimize code, but you may not realize that your choice in the code that you eliminate or how you optimize those lines of code may be informed by your worldview. It may be unconsciously informed that way. And so one of the big projects I think for everyone is to recognize that that each individual across the enterprise that touches an AI-enabled system, from design all the way through towards the end, towards the use in the field, has a role, has some responsibility, and you can't just have an anointed subject matter expert that sort of rides herd over the whole thing, the way that we sometimes think of like lawyers do, right? It's like, no, I mean, if legal considerations should also, by the way, be considered throughout that life cycle, not just at the very end. It's the same sort of principle.
So how in the actual, like, is this actually be like in these processes of these considerations, is this actually being incorporated into the Army, I don't know, life cycle of making or fielding a technology?
So we're beginning to do so. So, in a couple of examples. One is piloting a program with DARPA, Urban Reconnaissance for Supervised Autonomy. And we brought in a group of subject matter experts, lawyers, philosophers, practitioners, folks who work in data science, to help the different performers think about legal, ethical concerns as they're working on this project for DARPA. It's way too resource intensive, but the idea was, can we bring that sort of intellectual capacity? Can we bring that kind of thinking earlier on in the process, as opposed to waiting for those legal gates like we do, say, if we're designing a new weapon system later on? The Army, for example, has worked with IVAS, with Microsoft. Microsoft has a separate, here's a corporation, has a separate ethics and society team that works in parallel with their project manager on their projects, right? Again, providing the feedback. And the feedback that I'm really talking about is not something new. And this is a point I'm trying to continue to raise with all my interaction with the Army. We already do risk management, right? We have a program about that. We have a system. We've grown up with that. So what we need to do is align our thinking that we're going to operate from our values, from the rule of law, take our system of risk management, and now expand and widen that scope so that we consider ethical considerations, legal considerations, impacts to society and policy, in addition to the other risk to mission, risk to force. We capture that, right? We impart risk management systems. And quite frankly, some of the risk we may feel is worthwhile. So then someone, in a sense, owns that risk decision. So we're not trying to create something new. It's really taking our existing systems and saying, okay, how is AI going to be different in terms of our whole acquisition process, in terms of testing evaluation? And can we then, in a sense, modify how we think about risk and open that aperture up? And then, again, having individual members throughout that life cycle be able to contribute to that risk discussion, right? We should not be ambushed at the end and say, oh my gosh, this is facial recognition, and one of our adversaries are going to use it to subjugate one of their populations. Well, we never thought that could happen. Well, maybe we should have thought about that early, and maybe that's a risk that we are willing to undertake because it's vital to our national security interest, but perhaps we should have some risk mitigation measures in terms of the democratization of that technology, or the proliferation of it, right?
Seems, and I'm taking your own words, like opening up the aperture, that these are questions you're arguing we all ask anyway, and we will ask anyway, but we need to be asking them earlier, and we need to be asking them in a measured and thought out way, instead of it avalanching and hitting us all at the end. Oh, wow, what have we done? Am I? Yeah.
I mean, even thinking of it from sort of that cold business return on investment sort of methodology. I mean, we're talking about investing billions of dollars in a technology where it's very difficult to define its particular end state, right? I mean, we're still in early phases of research, 1 to 3 level, right? Of really stretching the boundaries on it. We can't wait till the end to discover that we should have made a decision earlier on, right? So we can adopt our own agile process, right? I mean, DevSecOps, right? And we can employ those same sort of tried and true ways of doing our business, but also incorporate these kinds of thinking earlier and then throughout. And quite frankly, it's like there's a tendency that goes back to part of the beginning of our conversation, right? When you're asking Bob and I about philosophy and the military and whatnot, there's a tendency to just assume that that's going to be someone else's decision and responsibility. So here's an example, right? So who's in charge of ethics in the military? Everyone immediately thinks of the chaplains. Who's in charge of thinking about law? Well, that's my lawyer. But in our system, it's really the commander, and she's the one who makes that final decision, and she's informed by experts from and it's the same sort of way. So we need to create an environment where, in a sense, that sort of combination of thinking about risk in this way, in addition, perhaps introducing red teaming in a more consistent and widespread way like we do in developing software. And I think together, we'll ensure that we're developing the technology in the right kind of way. And then the other aspect of it is we are terrible at letting the public know what we're doing. Right? I mean, going to all these different groups and talking to them at conferences and panels, and having to explain what discrimination proportionality is, thinking about the law of armed conflict. The outside public has no idea how much education and then reinforcement training we've had in this area. It's not saying we get it right all the time. We just assume that they know that we practice that way. And so a big part of this is messaging back, right? So, again, the public is also not surprised when we want to develop a certain system or we make a certain decision along that same piece.
Vein, I've been wondering, have you, both of you, this is a question for you both, noticed any successes in trying to make conversations around specific agents or technologies, future especially? Have you noticed any successes in making those more philosophy laden?
So maybe, I guess the idea of success is, I mean, if this work, in its importance of bringing moral philosophy and ethics to the table, so it's front and center, I hear, Dave has given an example where they put a task force together. But I would actually be curious on Bob, on your side, have you seen similar successes, either, because of your own actions or other people kind of taking this, these questions more seriously?
I'm pretty sure that Colonel Barnes played a pretty substantial role in developing the ethical principles for the Department of Defense. And I have been encouraged so far in that in about 3 or 4 years ago, when this really started to catch some steam, we had the conversation kind of caught between two extremes, which is, hey, we really have to have these kinds of technologies or we're going to lose, right? That would be like the military realist and, I think it was the War on the Rocks article that was most like this was my drone ski ate your ethics, right? So this idea that the Russians or the Chinese were going to come up with a robot that was just going to render all of this conversation kind of cute and pointless. And then the other way led in some ways by some of the revolt at Google around Project Maven and those sorts of things, where there was just this idea that we just never could do it. Like it was just in principle wrong, no matter what, full stop. And if and now it's a question of sort of life or death. Are we willing to do this terrible thing in order to keep, our societies, our states safe and our people safe and those sorts of things? And I have really seen that has progressed a lot inside the halls of government that I've been privy to. I should, just to be clear to the audience, like I'm not yet sort of on the inside of any of these projects. I'm not in any of the AI task force or anything like that. But you can see these ideas working their way through, and it's in general kind of how we want to be across a lot of different problems. Usually, if you include the moral considerations in the problem statement, your solution can do a good job of dealing with those moral considerations. And so you don't get to the end of the process with this fabulous, piece of technology that suddenly we can't use because, whereas if I'd have given the computer scientist or the roboticist, the problem, hey, we want this thing to operate in a way that's morally okay. Oh, hey, we can do that, and you can still, kill the tank when you need to kill the tank, and you can still win the battle without, just embracing the idea of the dirty hands. So I have, I've seen that at least in terms of the messaging and the information space around this problem, both in academic philosophy and in the higher halls of government. So far, it's still, at least because I'm still down on the bleeding edge of things down here in my squadron with my soldiers, and that conversation is still really more about making. We're still worried about it down here.
Bob, you were just talking about how there's this AI, task force and ethics, and it seems to be maybe from a top-down level being implemented, but where you said you're at the bleeding edge, right? You guys are the soldiers on the ground. You're just about to talk about well, how is that reaching you, or maybe it's not yet, as I think you
sort of what's old is new again. Like the soldiers feel about this the way they have always felt about the moral issues surrounding our practice, which is there tends to be this misperception that if I overburden a soldier with their own moral reasoning and a sense of law and those sorts of things, that I'm doing some disservice to them, that I'm like tying a hand behind their back or something like that. And hardly any soldier actually feels that way. There's still a lot of soldiers, both in the Army now and sort of across time, when you pay attention to the accounts, really, really worry about these issues, and making sure that what they're doing matters. Soldiers care about whether or not they're on the right side of justice and the right side of history. Soldiers care whether or not they're killing the right people for the right reasons. And short of, finding, because we still have them, short of folks that belong somewhere on the psychopathy scale, most American soldiers don't want to make this choice between their sense of themselves as a moral person doing the right thing and the tools that we give them to do their job. And so it's nice to be able to point to things like the DoD ethical principles and say, look, your government gets it. And, you can, and if we were a little more transparent and a little more focused on getting that message out to soldiers, it would be helpful.
So I'm curious, David, from your perspective in these AI ethical principles, or is there latitude for, is it built in that there's latitude for a soldier to act ethically, even because when I think about it, I think you're in a situation where and this could be totally wrong because I really don't know, I know very little about what a soldier actually does. That if those orders are orders. and it might go against a ethics or morals of a soldier, is it built in, to the ethical code that they could act ethically if they needed to, or felt the need to?
And in a sense, it can be, and it should be, right? So we think about the principles. I mean, the way that they're designed is they seem somewhat vague. They are aspirational, right? To use a phrase that Bob and I would recognize, right? They're range fans. They help provide some guidance, and in particular in terms of the development and implementation of it. But just like the unhelpful phrase of killer robots, the use of AI on the battlefield is only one way that the Army is going to utilize AI, right? It's going to be everywhere. It's going to be in talent management, human resources. It's going to be in automatic lights in your office. It's going to be in predictive maintenance, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, but also on the battlefield. And by the way, for the next few decades, we're going to have a combination of legacy, sort of this hybrid with AI, sort of mixed, as some people maybe undereducated might say, like, we'll sprinkle more AI on a system. And there's some design from the ground up to use artificial intelligence. And so what's critical in all of that is the communication piece, but it's also the education piece. So what is every individual in the Army, from the newest private, both civilian and military, all the way up to the secretary, need to know about artificial intelligence, both its promise, but also its pitfalls and its risks. And so the focus is not just on, and can't be solely on, the technology and the development of that, right? We have to think about the whole .mil-PF, sort of concept and construct. And so what we owe Bob's soldiers when, he goes to field this equipment, is that smart people in the Army, in our labs, in our partners in academia and the industry, have thought through sort of the organization for how we might reorganize, how we actually employ it, and employ it in both a lawful and effective way. The education involved in that system, those things other than outside just the tech itself. Because too often, and Bob probably share the same experiences, not only have we been both under fire, but we've also had, well-intended contractors show up on a fob with some kind of new bot, with not much explanation, not much how to use it, not kind of testing it out, because there was that need. But we have some time now, as we're rapidly developing this, we can be thoughtful about how we want his soldiers to employ it, so that they aren't burdened by additional consideration constraints, right? In a sense, maybe we can actually lessen the cognitive burden, perhaps give him or her more situational awareness, so that they can accomplish their mission with less risk to their own forces, to their own squads, but also prevent collateral damage and be able to achieve the effects we want to on the enemy. And so it takes sort of all of us to be thinking that way. Because if we just say, okay, here's this new gee whiz thing, and we just go hand it to them, they'll figure it out. I mean, they're soldiers or Marines are they're very smart, and they want to employ it, they want to do it the right way. And but if they don't trust it, or if it's not doing what they want to, they're just not going to use it. Part of my thinking and been working in this space even pre my direction into the technological aspects of it is how do we educate all of our soldiers and leaders in thinking about fighting a war in a legal and ethical manner, so that they don't have time in the immediacy of the situation to be reflective at that point. So we have to ensure that all that education, that those training events are fruitful, that they're well thought out beforehand, that they're tested on it in terms of different case studies and in practice, so that when they're faced with the situation, they'll be able, they can in a sense rely back on that, right? I mean, in a sense, this is kind of a very virtue way perhaps of looking at it, but it requires a lot of homework up front.
Can I ask, this might be real far afield, so everyone can say we're not ready to handle, like, this is a huge question, but it's sort of a two-parter. The one is, for the both of you, where do these come from, right? Where do your ethics come from. That's more of a metaphysical question, I understand. And then the follow-up to that is, what do you do when you run into somebody interorganizationally who has different standards of ethics? And how do you work through that complication, because you're both, I would understand, or I would think, trying to work towards similar goals?
So to the first question, the source of ethics, the source of moral value. So I would point in the direction, for me, and there are philosophers that disagree with me, but I am most interested in two approaches. So the first is that the values we have are fragmentary. So this is Tom Nagel's The Fragmentation of Value, and this idea is that there's more than one way to look at a situation and understand how value comes to that situation. And when I teach this to my soldiers, I say most moral dilemmas are created by the differences in 6 words. So the difference between good and bad, right and wrong, and virtuous and vicious. Right? So in a sense, all 6 of those words mean kind of the same thing, but they mean really different things as well, right? So a volcano can be bad, but a volcano is not wrong. In the same way that, my action might be right, but the result of that action could still be bad. And so, the way our language describes things that we care about leads us to this idea that moral value is fragmentary in this sense. And I'm deeply suspicious of anybody who's going to throw down, an algorithm or a slide rule that tells us, hey, here's how all this right stuff turns into good stuff and how all this virtuous stuff turns it. Like, I just don't think these things commensurate. I think it takes judgment. And then the other source of value that I find to take a lot of stock in is the evolutionary story of humanity. And for all the places you can point to in our history that are just despicable and awful, we have robust cross-cultural psychological capacities to respect other people as people, to commiserate with their suffering as important, right? So we share in their suffering and we rejoice in their success, and a psychological capacity to view ourselves as an individual across time who does certain things and doesn't do other things. And I think that sort of is enough for me to get off into these conversations with people. And I have only found a very few people in my experience when really, really pressed. I spend a lot of time talking to my soldiers about the movie The Big Lebowski. It's everything you ever wanted to know about being a Cab Scout you can learn by watching the dude in The Big Lebowski. And I think his buddy Carl has the best response to this nihilism. Like, you're supposed to be a nihilist. Nobody is really actually a nihilist. And so, there are very few that I have found that are really just hard bitten. And, it takes conversation and it takes getting to know people if they're coming at it, and to recognize that, I guess probably to put a little more concrete on it. And one of the biggest problems in moral conversations in the Army is that, like, a general officer has to make decisions viewing the Army in terms of big numbers. Like, if I do this, 1,000 people are going to go here and 200 people are going to die, right? And the problem is for those 1,000 people, that's obviously the right choice. But for one of those 200, this is a really bad day, right? And it's really hard to figure out how to reconcile those two things in conversation. Sometimes you can get them together, but usually the best way to have the conversation is to just tell the truth about about what's, I don't know if this is a cussing podcast, but like, hey,
Please.
you're going to have a shitty day. And there's not a lot we can do about it. And people tend to respond to that. And so I think that answered both questions, but
Yeah. No, I think as we're kind of wrapping up for this, I think, I find it hopeful. I don't know if that's the right word, but at least the importance of your guys' work in terms of, like for example, like I don't know for Bob, like how many other people in your position have philosophy and ethics training, that teach their their soldiers via the Big Lebowski. But I think that's yeah. But I think, just in general, I think that this, for me, and this is why I was really excited to talk about this today is, it's a black box for me in terms of how, ethics and morality gets entered into the picture in the army and the soldier world and how it looks like to everybody. And this was a great jumping off conversation for that. So I'm really glad that we could bring up all these issues and talk about it. We started talking about killer robots, but I think your point, Bob, is that the core of the issue is something that we have been struggling with, and reduces down to this really important question. And I think our important question right now is to figure out who won this this whole game, this round of field test. And looking at the scoreboard, there's a whole lot of zeros, but y'all did nail it, Bob and Dave, with that one last round that you guys did. So congratulations to your respective fathers.
So this makes me think slightly about the old Monty Python Flying Circus sketch that had the Greek philosophers against the German philosophers in a game of soccer. So a competition between cognitive scientists and philosophers can go in many directions.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, this has been really, really fun. Thank you guys so much. And I just want to end with one last question for the both of y'all. And that is, this is a podcast about collaboration. So we want your advice on how do you collaborate well? Like, what are your secrets of a successful collaboration?
Well, I mean, I think what comes to mind immediately is, people want to look for other individuals who share, same values, the same way of thinking, but that's not actually the best way to collaborate, right? It might get the job done, but I mean, especially coming from a philosophy background, I really enjoy working with folks with diverse perspectives, and even will play the antagonist, right? Because it makes the final collaboration even better, right? You unpack and uncover other ways of appreciating the problem, and perhaps different ways of potentially solving it. But that takes some work, and it takes a bit of humility to realize that yes, I'm looking for people, which is actually pretty easy for me. Just find smarter people who are who have different views from me, which is just about everybody, and then trying to bring that together.
Bob, how about you?
I think the principle of charity. So approaching problem sets, understanding that the folks you're collaborating with believe what they believe and think what they think because they're smart and because they're good people, and then going from there and making sure that you can keep kindness in view, right? So a commitment to the truth, a principle of charity, and the ability to be kind to each other in collaboration, and you're gonna.
Bob and David, thank you so much for playing, and we look forward to your future work. For those of you listening out there, thank you for spending time with us. Make sure to like and subscribe, and if you want to read more about David and Bob's work, look in the episode description. Thank you, and have a good day.